When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
This episode is brought to you by Facebook. So you were scrolling on Marketplace, and there it was, the bike you'd been searching for. You sent a message, and it turned out the seller was super chatty, kind of funny, and an avid cyclist. The next thing you know, you're in a cycling crew. Well, a community cycling group. The thing about Facebook, you might find more than what you're looking for. From a browse to a bike ride, this summer find more on Facebook.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. As we mark 250 years since the crafting of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, this formative document in the crafting of the nation's identity has also been a constant source of conflict and debate. My guest today, in the recently released book, Divided Over the Declaration, How an Enduring Debate Sustains the Vision of America, explores how the Declaration of Independence has been interpreted and reinterpreted by presidents, reformers, and political movements over time. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to explore this topic with him in this episode. Welcome, dear listeners, to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Tony Williams is a senior fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute and a scholar of the American founding, the author of 6 claimed works of narrative history, including The Pax and the Covenant, Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged a Nation, and Hamilton, An American Biography. Williams co-authored this book with David J. Bobb, the president and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute. Williams speaks frequently across the country on history and civics. And as you'll see in our conversation, he brings a wealth of knowledge and insight to this topic of the enduring debate over the Declaration and what it means for Americans in the present day. I'll have a link to his book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, so that you can get a copy of your own once you're done listening to this episode. Speaking of, without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my conversation with Tony.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
Tony, thank you so much for joining us today on Presidencies. I greatly appreciate you coming on to talk about your new book.
Thank you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, and it's interesting, I'll say, like one of the most fascinating things in reading your book, I think we have this kind of misconception that people have approached the Declaration of Independence the same way over time. And one thing that you and your co-author really help us to understand as readers is that that's not the case. And there have been so many different interpretations and approaches to the Declaration. And it's interesting as we go along in our conversation, we'll talk about, how these have changed over time. But I thought we would start kind of at the beginning, the actual drafting of it in our conversation, because you describe how Jefferson intended for the Declaration of Independence, quote, to be an expression of the American mind. So would you mind sharing a little more about what went into the crafting of this document? And was the intent at the beginning for it to be, as you described it later in the book, as, quote, a practical instrument rather than just an outline of abstract ideas?
Right. That's all great questions to start. So I think you're absolutely right that we've been divided over the Declaration for 250 years, and that's not a surprise because we were divided over the question of independence and over the Declaration from the beginning, right? And so, as you know, we were talking a lot about rights and a lot about self-government. Of course, everyone learned in school about no taxation without representation and so forth, against British taxes and tyranny. And so that was going on for over a decade. And then when we get 1775, the colonists go to war with Great Britain, right? And for over a year, we do not declare independence. And there's a huge debate over that question of independence. John Adams, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, other sort of radicals in the Continental Congress are pushing for independence, but there are others who don't want to separate, right? Call them moderates, I suppose. They're patriots, but they just don't want to break the relationship. People like John Dickinson and others are more wary of splitting off. So the debate really gets propelled forward by Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and which becomes the best-selling sort of Harry Potter of its day. And the Second Continental Congress increasingly debates the question of independence. And by June, early June, June 7th, we have Richard Henry Lee introduce his resolution for independence, that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent. And so that goes up for consideration. A committee is appointed by the Second Continental Congress that includes Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. And Jefferson largely drafts the document. And what he's saying in that letter later on to Henry Lee about the expression of the American mind, which is a very beautiful way to put it, or the harmonizing sentiments of the day, is that he's saying, look, I'm not original. I'm not trying to be original. These are thoughts and ideas that have been going on in the colonies for well over a decade. I also borrowed them from what he called the elementary books of public right, like Aristotle and Cicero, so ancient thought, but also Locke, Sidney, thinkers of the Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment, as well as Protestant Christianity influenced the ideas and so forth, and the experience under the British. So all these traditions come together, these harmonizing sentiments, this expression of the American mind, and we get the Declaration of Independence. But even that was fiercely debated, right? Both the question of independence and the Declaration are fiercely debated. On July 1st, John Dickinson, John Adams, and their allies square off in Congress, and they have this titanic debate. Tragically, the record of it is pretty much lost. We have some rough outlines of what was said. But they vote yes, the Congress, for the resolution for independence on July 2nd, which John Adams thought would be our 4th of July with celebrations and pomp and circumstance and grand illuminations. And then we have the Declaration debated itself, right? And so for the better part of 2 days before it was adopted, right? And the Congress changed about a quarter of it. So all of this is to say that there was a significant debate, as you point out, over the Declaration. Colonists were divided over the Declaration, divided over independence, and eventually came out for both, and we declared independence.
Yeah, it's funny. July 2nd, I've taken to calling John Adams's Independence Day.
I like that. That's good.
Or Adams.
Sure.
But yeah, it's fascinating because, this idea of independence, and you definitely look into the historical record, and it was so hotly debated. It wasn't a guarantee. And I think we sometimes forget that even then, this was a discussion. This is something that in this process, this new forging of government, it took some time to get everybody on the same page. And they were never really completely on the same page, but things happened and started moving forward.
Right. And you were right. I think another part of your question was the abstract nature of the rights. Certainly, these are pretty abstract rights in the second paragraph of the Declaration, right? We all know the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Endowed by their creator. So the reason we call it a practical document is not only this long debate that takes place, but because it sets up self-government, right? That's really the simple answer. It's practical because of human nature, recognizes human nature, right? The dignity of each person, the rights that they hold, that they were created with as human beings. And it also points out the means by which they're going to govern themselves, right? And that is very practical, right? And that leads also to debate and deliberation, right? Because we're engaging in the hard work of self government. Out of that flows compromise, forging consensus, right? And is a source then of unity rather than just division. But it's that practical part of self governance, call it democracy, call it republicanism, that the document sets up. That then becomes a very practical thing that we've engaged in for 250 years, right? And hopefully we'll continue to do so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting because, even once you get to the next generation, past the revolution, you start to see engagement with the Declaration, trying to figure out what it all means. And prior to the Civil War, you note how both in Texas and in California, when they were trying to establish governments there, folks turned to the Declaration of Independence for inspiration. So, Tony, what sentiments did people at that time, this next generation, turn to in the Declaration, and how did interpretations of the Declaration differ in free states and territories versus those that permitted the enslavement of individuals?
Yeah, again, a series of great questions. So in general, I would say that the debate, pretty much from day one up through the Civil War, is going to be really focused in a lot of ways, not exclusively, but in a lot of ways, on the question of slavery and its expansion to the West, right? Especially as Americans start moving west, which is pretty much immediate. And there's just a whole debate over human equality, who's included in this, who's making claims on it, right? Enslaved people make claims on it, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and then statesmen, right? Politicians like Abraham Lincoln, Charles Sumner, John Quincy Adams, so forth. And I think we'll get to them in a few minutes. But they make the argument that it is expansionary for the understanding of who's included, right? That all men are indeed created equal, and that includes everyone, all human beings, right? But there are those who deny it, right? Particularly slaveholders and particularly many Southerners, right? And so we have on the other side of the equation people like John Calhoun, Chief Justice Roger Taney of the Supreme Court, who issues his infamous Dred Scott decision. We have even Stephen Douglas, who debates Lincoln. We have the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. So we tell all their stories, but in terms of that expansion out west, that debate continues, right? And so when they're setting up these new territories and states, and in the case of Texas, initially an independent country, an independent republic, they copy the Declaration, right? And they copy it for an obvious reason, in the sense that they want to be free, right? They want liberty. They're claiming their rights, their natural rights, and they're also claiming self-government itself, right? Republicanism. But in addition to that, the question of equality comes up, right? And it comes up certainly in Texas, it comes up in California, in that state constitution, and it comes up even during the Civil War in Kansas during the 1850s, right? As we have these rival constitutions that are set up. We basically have two governments set up. And it's not surprising that these documents are heavily influenced by the Declaration. But where we have slaveholding states, or where in Kansas we have claims on being a slaveholding state in one of the rival governments. It's pretty much all the same except for equality, right? And so they fudge on equality. They talk about all men are created equal, but also slavery is an inherent property right, right, of human property, right? And Madison actually dispelled this at the Constitutional Convention. He said, look, there's no property in man in this document, right? We don't recognize the institution of slavery. But the Southern slaveholders, when they're forming new governments, do. Okay. And you see this in the lead up to the Civil War, certainly in their documents for secession. In the free states, it's not surprising they pretty much adopt it lock, stock, and barrel, right? And so they're adopting the principle of human equality, but also natural rights and self-government. So that is how the debate shapes up as Americans move west, and it really is a central part of what they're doing, right? Because they're trying to define who they are in this new state. What's their understanding of what it means to be an American? Some say free, natural rights, human equality. Others say, well, yeah, all of that. I want to accept that, all white men are created equal.
Well, and it's interesting because that's one thing that you and your co-author discuss in your book. It's divided over the Declaration, but this is also in conversation with that other key document of the crafting of the United States, the Constitution. And you share how in the lead up to the Civil War, and you mentioned some of these folks, people like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, who saw the Declaration and the U.S. Constitution as working together, while others like William Lloyd Garrison felt that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document opposed to this ideal in the Declaration of all men being equal. So I was wondering, can you talk more about the differences in their ideologies and what it tells us about the larger societal shifts that culminated in the Civil War and Reconstruction?
Sure. We start with in one of the chapters the vignette, of course, and on Lincoln, his fragment on the Constitution, and how he calls the Declaration so beautifully, so poetically, the apple of gold, right? And it's really the sort of the heart, the center of what it means to be an American, right? And he then talks about how in this biblical phrasing, the picture of silver is then surrounds the apple, right? And he says the apple, the picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So it's the apple of gold and the picture of silver. They're inextricable. They're linked together, right? Supporting the ideals of human nature and of rights and of self-government. And then it creates that practical document, the Constitution, that establishes that not only just the framework, but how the government's actually going to work. And in this debate, right, you have a lot of people who have varying points of view. And I think one of the most salient and interesting debates that we see in the book and in that part of history is that between Frederick Douglass, the great Black abolitionist who was formerly enslaved and escaped to freedom and then became a great powerful orator and spokesman for human equality, and his ally initially, William Lloyd Garrison, who was in charge of the American Anti-Slavery Society and had his famous newspaper, The Liberator. And so we have Garrison is interesting, right? Because he supports the Declaration, but up to a point, right? He really sees that this is a document of human equality. He really sees it as one of natural rights. He believes in all of that, but he doesn't believe in political participation, right? So it's kind of that self-government piece that he's really kind of grappling with, because he believed that the system was so utterly corrupted by slavery that he wanted no part of it, right? And the masthead of his newspaper said, no union with slaveholders, right? And so he believes that you shouldn't vote, right? And that he's not going to vote. He just doesn't want to participate in the American experiment and self-government. He also opposes the part of the Declaration where he talks about the right of rebellion, right? He basically says, enslaved people should not resist violently because, his Quaker roots, and he supports nonviolence. So Douglas, however, supports resistance and violence. I mean, he did as an enslaved person, and that's what, in part, gave him his human dignity back, as he fought for, the overseer not to touch him anymore. So, because of that, no union slaveholders, he burns the Constitution on the 4th of July. I mean, this is sort of how radical it becomes. He burns the Constitution and calls it an agreement with hell and a covenant with death. I mean, that's a pretty damning indictment of the Constitution. And so he sees our system as utterly flawed. Douglas, on the other hand, is interesting because once he joins the abolitionist movement after he escapes to freedom, he joins sort of with forces with Garrison and Garrison's allies, and he becomes a speaker. And he speaks a lot about his experience as an enslaved person under this brutal system of slavery. And he wants to start, he's a really smart guy, he's really articulate. So he wants to start expounding upon abolitionism and abolitionist principles and sort of promote his understanding of that. And Garrison says, no, you have to stick to the script. You're an enslaved person. And Douglas feels like, yeah, you can't just trumpet me out as sort of a model kind of enslaved person who can only talk about his experience. I'm a pretty thoughtful guy. So they break. And Douglas initially sees the Constitution as pro-slavery. He agrees with Garrison, but then he changes his mind, and he even goes farther than Lincoln, right? So he starts to see the document as an anti-slavery document, like Lincoln. But then he goes farther and says basically the federal government could end slavery immediately based upon the Constitution. And Lincoln's like, well, hold on. The Congress doesn't have the power. The president doesn't have the power. Normally, this is a state institution, state law. So there's this big, complicated kind of constitutional interpretation. But Douglas is for immediatism, like I said, farther than Lincoln. And so he breaks with Garrison. So all of these sort of complex kind of political philosophies, constitutional interpretations reveal some really important differences and how they understand the Declaration of Independence as well as the Constitution, as you point out.
Well, and it's interesting, this idea of, participating in government versus actively non-participating in kind of this, it's so corrupt. I'm just going to show my disgust with it by being hands off. And it's, and I know we'll talk more about the implications and how we can interpret the Declaration in the present day a little later, but it is interesting because it seems like we are still having some of these conversations. How do we deal with the political issues of the time, engagement versus non-engagement? How do we protest? How do we compromise? It's interesting, and I think that you really highlight this in the historical context, and it's just interesting that we've got those resonances even in the modern day.
Well, sure. I mean, yeah, none of this has really changed, right? All the themes in the book are still with us, and we can talk about that throughout our conversation. But you're right, and these are questions that have sort of unchanging relevance to them, and it's an important question, right? I mean, Garrison has that moral purity, right? But if you're gonna have, but he lacks prudence, right? But he has that moral purity, and he's just going to sort of go to the grave, if you will, based upon his principles. And so, I can respect him as a man of principle. But on the other hand, he's not very prudent, right, in terms of practical wisdom and applying these principles to society. And in a lot of ways, he's rejecting many parts of the American experiment, and both in terms of the Declaration and the Constitution. And I'm not sure that I find, when I look at the historical period, that as necessarily the best way to go about things. Lincoln combines principles, as does Douglas, principles and moral truths with practical action. So, I'll leave it to your viewers to kind of grapple with this. These are big questions, and we probably won't solve them today.
No. It's a conversation that has been ongoing for generations and centuries. So
yeah, it will continue. It won't go away.
But it's interesting, as not just people trying to form a government turn to the Declaration as this starting point, as this place to draw inspiration from. You bring up instances in the book where individuals or groups sought to adopt their own declarations of independence, including the Declaration of Sentiments from the Seneca Falls Convention and the 1970 Black Declaration of Independence. So, can you share more about these later declarations and what they tell us about what groups felt was lacking or in need of revision from the original declaration?
That's a great way to put it. I really like the way you frame that. And I think the answer is that, let's take Seneca Falls first in chronological order. Women were not enjoying equality, whatever promise it might have had as an ideal, as an aspiration in the Declaration of Independence itself. It obviously was not fully realized in terms of so many different rights in society. Now, call these mostly civil and political rights, but still, they're not enjoying their full equality as they want to. Women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott were kept out of the world's first anti-slavery convention in London in 1840, and they resolved to hold a convention for women's rights. And when they do, 8 years later in Seneca Falls, they do a couple things. They use the declaration as inspiration to write their own declaration. And these are some of the changes. One is they start very interestingly saying all men and women are created equal, right? Which is awfully interesting because, as David and I point out, there was a universality in the original document. So how do we understand that? Does that call the original document into question? Is it saying that it only applied to sort of white property owning white males, or are we questioning the universality? Or maybe it's just a rhetorical device, but they want to make sure that it's obvious that they are included in this document, that they were included, in all men and women being created equal. Secondly, they have a list of grievances, right? And a lot of these are educational opportunity and equal, sort of access to jobs and professions and the ministry and different things. But one of their grievances, they say that, the history of man against women is a long history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Now, I don't, as a humorous aside, I think my wife could come up with a lot of grievances against me as well. A history of repeated grievances and injuries and usurpations, they say, over 30 years. But more seriously, I mean, they have that list of grievances, and one of the grievances, of course, is that they do not enjoy what they call the inalienable right of suffrage. Okay, because women obviously could not vote, and that raises another interesting question about whether suffrage is an inalienable right, whether it's a civil right, political right. That's awfully interesting. But they are making a claim on it, right? So they're making a claim on equality. They're making a claim on being equal citizens, right? And I think the logic of their argument is to say that, look, how can we possibly, under the Declaration, be citizens and give our consent to this representative government if we don't have a voice, if we don't vote, right? If we're barred from the vote for nothing more than our sex, and so that's a really good argument, So there's a lot to chew on with that, right? And their sort of rewriting of it. But it's a remarkable document, the Declaration of Sentiments. The later one by this 1970 Black Convention is awfully interesting too. So we frame out that chapter on civil rights with introduce it with Malcolm X, who had a lot to say about the March on Washington, or what he called the farce on Washington, and had he said, "I don't see an American dream, I see an American nightmare." Right, and obviously not enjoying rights. So he's going to be a little bit more on the radical side of things in the civil rights movement, or even sort of outside of it. But then we get to the March on Washington with John Lewis and Martin Luther King and their sort of rival understandings of it. Now, King is obviously squarely in line with appealing to the American dream, with saying that, he calls it the magnificent words of the Declaration and the Constitution, and he says the promise that, yes, all men, white men as well as black men, are created equal, right? So he makes a claim on that declaration. He says, look, we've endured slavery, we've endured segregation for more than 340 years, and we have come to cash a check, right? It was a promissory note. A promissory note's like a check. It's like it's something that's owed to you, but hasn't been fulfilled yet. And he's saying we've waited a really long time, and we're here at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., at the March on Washington, to make a claim on the Declaration, on those rights. We are Americans. We are entitled to those rights. And it's obviously just one of the great speeches of the 20th century. John Lewis has a slightly different point of view because he's in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is the nickname SNCC, and it's younger, right? And they're pressing for equality now, and they don't want to wait, and they don't want to compromise, right? And so he basically is forced to rewrite his speech by some of the leaders of the march, included Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, and others, who tell him to just sort of pull back his rhetoric a little bit, because he's basically, one of his quotes is that he's in the original speech is that he's going to, he wants blacks to march through the South if they don't get equal rights, like Sherman marched to the sea, right? Sort of burning down Atlanta and other cities. So it's really sort of quite radical compared to King, especially. Although he agrees with King on the fundamental premises of wanting equality and so forth, and justice. To get to the Black Convention, though, it's a much more radical document, right? It's one that basically is almost satirical, right? Almost sort of mocking in terms of the Declaration of Independence. And it basically, takes more of a Malcolm X look at the Declaration, and saying that, this American experiment, this American dream that King talks about, it's not a reality. And to just give you an idea of how much they're influenced, maybe by the Black Power movement, by Black liberation theology. I'll just read a little bit of it quickly. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are not only created equal, but that when this equality and these rights are deliberately and consistently refused, withheld, or abnegated, men are bound by self-respect and honor to rise up in righteous indignation to secure them. When the traditions and systems of the majority become oppressive, it is the right of the minorities to use every necessary and accessible means to protest and disrupt the machinery of oppression. When a long train of abuses manifestly designed to reduce them under absolute racist domination, they had a duty radically to confront such government or system of traditions. Okay, and it says, it finished up with their list of grievances about Black ghettos, economic inequality, police brutality, saying, unless we receive full redress and relief from these inhumanities, we will move to renounce all allegiance to this nation. So you can see that it's just, it's definitely not the kind of words that King would use, but born out of a profound dissatisfaction, a profound frustration with, the realities of urban life, particularly, or life in the South under the horrors of segregation. So you can see that is born out of that frustration. But, I guess the question, that, we'll leave readers with, or listeners to this podcast is, which one seems to work the best, right? Which one seems to have a pull on the American system? What results in these landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act, like the Voting Rights Act, and so forth. So these sort of seminal changes that were produced from the Civil Rights Movement, whose understanding, might be the best. There's a debate there, right? And so we'll leave it to your listeners to debate and deliberate over that, as well as readers of the book.
Well, and of course, I think it's important to note that this Black Declaration of Independence came in 1970, and by this point, both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And this is from a community that's, not only grieving the loss of these two great leaders, but also with this increase in violence and this uncertainty, it's understandable why there was this outrage.
Sure. Sure. And, there's still, just endemic poverty in a lot of these places that I mentioned, and just, continued police brutality and so forth. So yeah, no, I mean, one can understand the frustration, as you say, there were assassinations, there were various, call them race riots and various uprisings in the cities throughout, the mid to late 60s and so forth. And it's important to know a lot of this was also in the wake of this landmark legislation, right? And so I think you have these, a lot of historians talk about these rising expectations for equality, for justice, sort of now, what some call the fierce urgency of now was not being fulfilled as fast as people wanted to. And so it's born out of that, right? So there's some really interesting and important, relevant historical circumstances in which these documents take shape throughout the book, throughout our history.
Absolutely. And I know our listeners would love to dive in more to that. I have no doubt. And I'll definitely refer you to the book because y'all do such a great job of kind of helping us to understand the moment that these documents were created and helping us to understand why. But it does get back to this idea of the inspiration of the original Declaration. And I couldn't resist because, of course, being the presidencies of the United States, when you brought up two presidents who had vastly different viewpoints of the Declaration, I had to ask you about them. So, Tony, as your work moves into the 20th century, you bring up the viewpoints of the Declaration by Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Calvin Coolidge. Whereas Coolidge saw the document as an inspiration, Wilson felt it to be, quote, of no consequence for folks in his era. And so I was wondering, would you mind talking about how they arrived at these two very different viewpoints?
Sure. No, it is the presidency's podcast, right? So I think it's very, very good question. So, yeah, in a nutshell, Wilson was a progressive at the turn of the century, along with Theodore Roosevelt and many others at the time. Various they were reformers, and he and others, but we'll stick to Wilson more particularly, is that, he was influenced, a lot by, the ideas of Charles Darwin and Hegel and Marx and so forth. And all of them saw a progressive march of history, right? Almost scientifically, that life, that human nature, society was all improving, and it happened sort of, in a linear fashion throughout history. And so he believed, he looks back on 1776 and the Declaration and says, this was really good for back then. It was a really important document in the circumstances of the time. But we've moved beyond that, right? We're a modern industrial society. We've got different problems. We're not sort of this horse and buggy or sort of horseback age in terms of, how we're living. We live in a modern industrial and urban world. And so he's going to say very forthrightly, you know, the principles of the Declaration in the second paragraph, just kind of ignore them. They're not really that important. They're not really that relevant. They're kind of abstract. They don't really have much impact on our lives. Just ignore the second paragraph, which is about human equality, self-government, and natural rights, right? But another thinker that influences him is the British thinker Edmund Burke, right, who also sees an evolutionary tract of history. So Wilson is influenced by that and has a view of the Declaration that wants to shun it, to the side and not make it very important. It's just not very relevant to 1912. Calvin Coolidge, on the other hand, is a conservative, right? And so by definition, simply a conservative wants to conserve that which has come before, right? And only accept change and reform very haltingly. So very different from Wilson. And his view is that we should take the the Declaration of Independence as it stands, right? And he says this very forthrightly. He basically says, look, if human beings are equal, that's final, right? If we have natural rights, that's final, right? If we have self-government, that's final. And so these principles are unchanging, they're immutable. Our understanding of them might change, but the principles themselves don't change. And so Coolidge is going to take on the 150th anniversary, by the way, of the Declaration and in his speech up in Philadelphia. He's basically going to say these principles were true 150 years before that in 1776. They were true in 1926. They'll be true in 2026, and they'll be true 500 years from now, right? So he and Wilson, in a nutshell, have very differing views on the Declaration and its core principles in that second paragraph.
Well, and both of these men were president in a time that the world was changing. There was so much change going on. And so I was wondering, expanding out from Wilson and Coolidge, from their personal viewpoints on the Declaration, could you share more on the role the Declaration played in the larger political debates during the age of American imperialism and progressivism in the first decades of the 20th century?
Sure, sure. So one of the really important chapters in the book is on foreign policy, which was an area that I knew had some mention of the Declaration, particularly in the debate over the Spanish-American War. Right. So we have these great victories by Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders and the Black Buffalo Soldiers and the cavalry up San Juan Hill. They take Cuba, Santiago. So that war is won. And then Commodore Dewey wins his victory out in Manila Bay over the Spanish, right? In this sort of great and dramatic naval battle. In the peace, the peace is made and the peace treaty is signed, and then it's sent, of course, to the Senate for ratification. In the lead up to that debate, there's a massive public debate that takes up place, especially in the fall of 1898, over what was called imperialism, right? Imperialism, call it expansionism, globalism. So as America's role in the world expands, there's a big debate over that change. And so you have the formation of the Anti-Imperialist League and others, just important intellectuals, industrialists, Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, others, other important figures, are arguing against that role in the world, are arguing against imperialism. Others, Henry Cabot Lodge, Theodore Roosevelt, and others support an expanded sort of missionary impulse of American ideals around the world, sort of spreading democracy in the way that we phrase it. And that shapes it to be a massive debate in the Senate, right? And I thought I'd find one or two mentions of the Declaration. It was literally debated for 2 months in December of 98 and January of 99 into early February. And the debate was over this question of imperialism with the Declaration front and center for about 6 hours a day. And, these speeches are pages long, many pages long in the congressional record, and they're going back and forth and they're arguing with each other, as senators do and should do. And they are arguing over the principle of consent primarily. And a lot of the debates kind of shape up to be like, well, if we incorporate these people, the Filipinos and the Cubans, if we take over their territory, like, if we annex them, then they're Americans. So then they can participate in self-government. And a lot of people are like, hold on. No, I don't think so. It doesn't really include everybody as a universal principle. So that's what some people argue. Others argue, no, you have to, they have to give their consent. But some wonder, well, can they give their consent from 8 or 10,000 miles away or more in the case of the Philippines, right? And other people say, well, can they give their consent because they don't really have the traditions, right? They don't really have the language of self-government. They don't have the experience of self-government in terms of self-government, in terms of freedom. And, they don't have like national congresses and representative government. And it's kind of mostly governed by like warlords and so forth. So, and they lived under as subjects under imperialism, under the Spanish for decades, if not centuries. And so it's a big question, right? Others say, in a social Darwinist point of view, can they give their consent because they're inferior, right? As sort of this ranking hierarchy of the races that was the horrible views of social Darwinism. So all those debates shape up over consent for 2 months. So this is a really vigorous kind of back and forth and this massive debate. And eventually the treaty is ratified, right? And it's really a debate over the purposes of American foreign policy, right? Are we going to be a beacon of democracy, an example, the exemplar of democracy and freedom and all that around the world? Are we going to go abroad and spread our values, our principles, our ideals and aspirations? And so sort of call it at the barrel of a gun, if you will. And these debates haven't gone away, right? I mean, Wilson had to engage them. Franklin Roosevelt was highly internationalist, right, during the Cold War. The document NSC 68, which is the militarization of the Cold War, quotes the Declaration of Independence, right? Because it's sort of seen as like, well, as they're fighting the sort of the godless communists, right, and their terror state, and then their one party state, like what are our American ideals? Like they're different from us, right, in this existential struggle around the world for freedom, totalitarianism versus democracy. But we've seen these debates come up too, right? In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Iran, even today, right? So without sort of going down sort of current events too much, these debates don't go away, right? We debate who we are as Americans, how we relate to the world. How does the Declaration inform that, right? This is very important, and I don't think that debate's going away anytime soon. I think it'll last again as long as there is a United States, right? As long as there's an America, we're going to hold ourselves up to these ideals, not only in politics and social issues and so forth, but also how we relate to the world. So again, some just really relevant questions are brought up over those debates over the Declaration.
Well, and it's interesting because as politics change and we see so much change in the 20th century, you have it goes from being, only male politicians to having female politicians, being able to have people of color actually get elected to office and be a part of this conversation, you know, and I think that's one thing that y'all highlight in your book is that they're also engaged with this conversation about the Declaration. And at one point in the book, you bring up two 20th century female politicians, Claire Booth Luce and Barbara Jordan. And as you note, while their politics were quite different, quote, they each anchored or sought to anchor their ideologies on the Declaration and what it means for politics. So, would you mind sharing a little about each of these women and what the comparison of the two tells us about ideas around the Declaration in the 20th century?
Sure, sure. That's a great question. As you know, we see the Declaration. We see as it unfolds throughout 250 years. We see that expansion, right? We see the additive nature of the Declaration and these rights and who's participating, who's included, and so forth. And that's a great story, right? And so Barbara Jordan is elected to Congress from Texas. She's the first African American woman elected to Congress from the South, and has comes into office around the time she's in Congress during the time of Watergate, right? And so her big thing, and as you say, there's a lot of commonalities in terms of how they understand the Declaration, but she wants to take a principled stand for self-government and constitutional government, right? And self-government for all, right? And so there's sort of similar arguments to what's going on with the civil rights movement and with King and so forth and John Lewis. But there's also holding government accountable, right? Holding government, holding office holders, holding our elected officials to the standards and ideals of what it means to be an American, right? And of our constitutional government, of our Republican form of government, of representation. And so that's one of her main projects. And she's not in Congress very long, but she has some really pivotal things to say, right? And an important role in Watergate. Luce, on the other hand, right, is a journalist and public intellectual, married to Henry Luce, who is the editor of Time, also of Life, of Sports Illustrated, and Fortune magazine. So he sort of has this publishing empire. And they are married. I just read a biography of Henry Luce, actually, and don't have, unfortunately, a very happy marriage. But so she's kind of quite independent of him, even within the marriage, but embraces a lot of the same ideas, right? She's conservative. She support, the Republican Party more on sort of the Eisenhower sort of modern Republican Party, and she is going to come out like Luce did, like Henry Luce did, for supportive of American ideals within the context of the American century. So kind of put her more in the context of the Cold War and sort of that post-war idealism, with American ideals and fighting communism, the Marshall Plan, and these all these incidents, and in terms of sort of facing off the containment of the Soviet Union. So both are guided by relatively different contexts, and yet, as you say, all national politics. People are listening to what they're saying, are public intellectuals, and some somewhat different milieu in the post-war political world, but agree on the centrality of the Declaration and holding ourselves accountable to the Declaration and recognizing its continuing importance in self-government.
Well, and that's a great segue into my final question as we wrap up our conversation, because towards the end of your book, you turn back to this idea of Americans in the present day feeling the sense of alienation and prescribe returning to a state of active citizenship as envisioned in the Declaration as a way to move forward. So, Tony, would you mind talking more about what it looks like to, as you wrote, quote, get right with the Declaration in the modern era?
Right, right. Great question. And really part of our project, not only with the book divided over the Declaration, but also David and I, David Bobb, my co-author, he's the president and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute, where I'm a senior fellow. And so one of our great projects at the Bill of Rights Institute and in the book is civic education, right? And citizenship. And so what we know in the end of the book, because we don't want to be Pollyannish about it, we don't want to, we're not having a kumbaya moment, but we recognize that Americans are divided, right? Clearly we are. Clearly we're polarized. We're divided over politics. We're divided over who's president. Every time there's an election, one side tries to nuke the other side out of existence, and we're not speaking to each other. Families are splitting up at Thanksgiving because, tragically, people aren't even talking to family members. People are losing friendships. People are defriending each other on Facebook or what have you. And it's really poisonous, right? I mean, we're divided over what kind of coffee you drink. I like to joke and say we're divided over the burritos we eat, and I mean, we were divided over America 250, right? In a lot of ways. Now we're divided over the Odyssey. It doesn't end, right? We're tired of it, right? And a lot of this polarization, as David, who read the last chapter of the book, points out, it can be somewhat exaggerated, right? It can be exaggerated by the loudest voices in the room on social media. It can be exaggerated by the media, right? Who's constantly telling us how divided we are. But what we do is cite some polls and some political science, some civics that show that we're not as divided as we think. That if you think about that core 70-80% of people, we agree on some basic things, right? Like, hey, we want to raise our kids well. We want to live in safe neighborhoods. We want good roads. We go down to Kiwanis or the Rotary Club and serve others. We take our kids off to Little League, that kind of thing. That we get along with each other, even if we disagree with each other on things like politics and cultural issues and so forth. So we're not quite as divided as we think, right? And so, but we think the Declaration, if we get right with the Declaration, right, what does that mean? Well, it means an understanding of human equality, right? It points us towards a respect for equal dignity of each person and the equality under the law and promoting equal opportunity for people, protecting everyone's equal rights, right? It also points us towards self government. So let's go back to the very first question when we started this conversation. We talked about how the Declaration set up self government and set up representative government. And what do? We debate, right? We deliberate. We have to listen to each other, right? We're not doing a very good job of that right now, right? But we need to listen to each other more and we need to compromise, right? We need to hear the other person's point of view, think about some areas of common ground, maybe even compromise a little bit, and try to forge some kind of consensus as Americans, right? We're kind of pretty terrible at that right now. But I'm hopeful, right? Because I'm hopeful because I believe in the ideals of the Declaration and I also assume that all of my fellow Americans do too, right? We may interpret it differently as we've done for 250 years, but we believe in the same ideals. We're in this together. We're in this project of this American experiment in liberty. We're in this project together. And I think we need to get back to that. And the only way we can do that is not going to happen in national politics and big culture. It's not going to happen on social media. It's going to happen in our communities, right? It's going to be people talking to their neighbor, sitting down with their friend, maybe they disagree with, and just having a beer and a coffee and just kind of laughing about politics and arguing a little bit, but then still being friends and maybe saying at the end of the conversation, our votes are probably going to cancel each other out, or something. Just not taking it just too seriously, right? And to get back to working together in the spirit of a common purpose and with a common identity, saying that, look, we're all Americans. We want the kids in our community to have a good playground plan. We want scouts to be vibrant, right? We want, as I said, the Little League or community theater to thrive, right? It's going to happen in the civic institutions of families, of churches, of schools, of local businesses, and local voluntary institutions. That's where our unity is going to come. That's where we're going to reestablish our ties as Americans. And if we do that, I think we'll get right with the Declaration. We're still going to disagree with each other, right? We're still going to have some heated debates and so forth, but we're not going to necessarily then see each other as existential threats to democracy, all right? Which we're not, right? We're just people just trying to live our lives. So I think we need to get back to that. And it's not not a kumbaya moment, but it is the hard work of self-government. And that's what David and I advise our readers and our listeners and so forth, is to have those civil conversations and to do the hard work of self-government. No one said it was going to be easy, but we're citizens, not subjects, right? And so no one rules us, we rule ourselves.
Absolutely. And I can't say it better. And I think that one thing that I took away from this read, this is an ongoing conversation. And so long as it is ongoing, so long as we are continuing this civil discourse, trying to figure it out together, there's hope. And I think that what you and David do in this book, helping to highlight that this thread of the Declaration has been woven through American history and continues to this day, I think it can give hope that there is a path forward through engagement.
Yeah. I mean, we start and then the book with Frederick Douglass. No one had more hope in America than him, right? Martin Luther King, when he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at the March on Washington, he had hope in America. It wasn't a child's hope. It was an informed hope that we could appeal to the better angels of our nature and we could do better. And we did better. So no, I have a lot of hope. We'll get there.
Well, and for our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about this ongoing and the history of this debate and discussion over the Declaration, the book is Divided Over the Declaration: How an Enduring Debate Sustains the Vision of America. Tony, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much for your work in this book. I cannot thank you enough. I think it's It was a great read, and there's so much more that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So I highly encourage our listeners to check it out and learn more.
Thank you. I had a great time and just a fantastic conversation with some really great questions that we need to ask. So thank you.
Absolutely. And if you're working on another book again in the future, please, I hope you'll reach out again, and we'd love to have you on Presidencies to continue the discussion.
Will do. I might be working on something on the actual presidency. So stay tuned.
You know how to find me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again to Tony Williams for joining us for this episode. As you can imagine, there is so much more in Tony and David's book that we did not get a chance to discuss in our conversation. So be sure to check out Divided Over the Declaration, How an Enduring Debate Sustains the Vision of America, in order to learn more. I'll have a link to the book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidencies podcast. The sustaining support of folks through Patreon and Substack ensures that I have the equipment and resources needed to produce and grow this podcast, and I cannot thank all of them enough. If you'd like to contribute for as little as $1 per month, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up there. Patrons of the podcast get access to an ad-free feed, which includes special patron-exclusive episodes. For the other sustaining option, if you haven't checked out the monthly newsletter yet, you can go to presidencies.substack.com to check out what's available for free. But I also have some special posts for paid subscribers if you'd like to sign up and contribute that way. If you're not able to contribute on an ongoing basis, but would still like to support the work of the Presidencies podcast, there are other ways to provide support. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podchaser, YouTube, or anywhere else with that capability. I recently had a comment on YouTube from Ashley left on my episode about Secretary of the Treasury Alexander J. Dallas. It turns out that Ashley is a descendant of Dallas and said that it was, quote, great information. Glad I found this. It's always amazing when descendants of some of the folks that we cover reach out. So thank you so much for commenting, Ashley. I hope the episode provided you with some good insight on your fifth great-grandfather. And please note that he is one of the most fascinating, underrated historical figures I've covered on Seat at the Table. So hopefully the episode will help to get him some more well-deserved attention. Thanks so much to all of you who have fulfilled book requests, as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.